The story of the California gold rush is one of men with gold pans and pickaxes. What is rarely told is that the women who arrived in California during that period built fortunes, brought down governments, and created the state's first permanent institutions. These 20 women are documented, real, and completely absent from the standard narrative. Number 1. Mary Ellen Pleasant. In 1852, when San Francisco was still a camp of tents and mud, a black woman stepped off the boat carrying a fortune she had inherited from her first husband, an abolitionist. Everyone there was chasing gold. She realized one thing: the people who truly got rich were not the ones holding the pickaxes, but the ones selling food, beds, and credit. She worked as a cook in the homes of the city's richest men and heard everything: which mines were about to take off, which banks were going to fail. She opened boarding houses and laundries and lent money with interest. Together with banker Thomas Bell, she controlled $30 million. In 1858, she gave John Brown $30,000 for the raid on Harper's Ferry. When he was hanged, a note with her initials was found in his pocket. In 1866, she sued the streetcar company that refused to let her board, and won. The press called her a witch and a blackmailer. History calls her the mother of civil rights in California. Number 2, Lola Montez. She showed up with a pet bear and ruled Gold Rush society with a whip. She was born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, but created a Spanish dancer identity for herself. In the 1840s, she became the mistress of King Ludwig I of Bavaria and gained so much power that she helped bring down the country's conservative government. A popular uprising drove her out. In 1853, she arrived in California, where the gold rush had filled the mountains with lonely men carrying pockets full of gold dust and almost no entertainment. Lola settled in the mining town of Grass Valley and brought along a pet bear that she kept chained in the backyard. Her act, the spider dance, showed her shaking fake spiders out from under her skirt, the most talked-about show in the state. Miners paid in gold dust to get a seat. When a local journalist wrote that the act was indecent, Lola went to the newspaper office with a whip in her hand to demand an explanation. Number 3. Charlie Parkhurst, California's best stagecoach driver, was not who everyone thought he was. If you needed to cross the California mountains during the gold rush with a box of gold dust under the seat, you wanted Charlie Parkhurst holding the reins. Charlie arrived around 1851, when people from all over the world were rushing to the Sierra Nevada. He drove stagecoaches along dirt roads between mining camps, with robbers lying in wait and sharp turns along the edges of cliffs. He lost an eye after being kicked by a horse and became known as One-Eyed Charlie. Short, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt, a cigar in the corner of his mouth, and always wearing gloves. No one questioned him. In 1867, he registered to vote in Soquel, Santa Cruz County, and in 1868, he voted in the presidential election. This went on for more than 20 years. When he died in December 1879, the doctor preparing the body discovered that Charlie had been born a woman, Charlotte, who had run away from an orphanage as a girl. The news made headlines across the country. None of his fellow drivers had ever suspected a thing. Number 4. Ah Toy, the woman who dragged gold miners into court. In 1849, when San Francisco was still a camp of tents, a young Chinese woman stepped off the boat alone. Her name was Ah Toy. She was one of the very few Chinese women in California, and within months, she became one of the most talked-about figures in the city. She set up her own business in an alley near Clay Street and charged in gold. The line stretched around the block. But then came the problem. Some miners started paying with pieces of polished brass, passing them off as gold. Anyone would have expected her to take the loss. Ah Toy did the opposite. She went to court, even though she barely spoke English, and sued the customers for fraud. The judge listened, and she won. She was the first Chinese woman on record to use the American justice system on her own behalf. With the money she saved, she expanded the business and spent years taking on police officers and mayors in that same courtroom. Number 5. Biddy Mason. When gold was discovered in 1848, California became everyone's destination. 300,000 people rushed there within a few years, but not everyone went willingly. Biddy Mason crossed the country on foot, walking behind a wagon and herding cattle for the man who claimed to own her. She left Mississippi, passed through Utah, and arrived in California in 1851 with 3 daughters. The problem was that California had entered the Union in 1850 as a free state. Robert Smith pretended that law did not exist and planned to take everyone to Texas, where slavery was legal. In 1856, the Los Angeles County Sheriff intercepted the group. Judge Benjamin Hayes heard the case and declared Biddy and 13 other people free. She became a midwife, delivered babies for 10 years, and saved every penny. In 1866, she bought a piece of land on Spring Street for $250. The city grew around it. When she died in 1891, she left behind about $300,000, more than $10 million today. Number 6. Dame Shirley, or Louise Amelia Knapp Smith Clapp. In 1851, a woman traveled up the Feather River to a camp called Rich Bar, deep in the California mountains. Her husband was a doctor and went there to treat the miners. She went to watch and write everything down. Louise wrote 23 letters to her sister in Massachusetts. She did not soften anything. She wrote about the lynchings, the duels, and the fever that could kill a man in 3 days. She wrote about the man who found enough gold to buy a farm and lost it all at the gambling table before Sunday. The letters were published in Pioneer magazine in 1854 under the name Dame Shirley. Few people read them at the time, but Bret Harte did, and he took entire characters, scenes, and lines from them for the stories that made him famous. He never mentioned her name. Today, historians say those letters are the most honest account of the gold rush that exists. She was the one who told the truth. Someone else got the credit. Number 7. Juanita of Downieville. In 1851, the gold rush had flooded California with people. Downieville was a mining camp in the mountains. Thousands of men, very few women, gold in the river, and whiskey on every corner. There was no judge, no jail either. On the night of July 4th, a Scottish miner named Frederick Cannon broke down the door of the home of Josefa Segovia, a Mexican woman everyone called Juanita. The next morning he came back. Some say he went to apologize. Others say he threatened her again. The argument ended with a knife in his chest. Within hours, they set up a jury in the middle of the street. The trial lasted less than a day. A doctor warned that she was pregnant and was run out of town for saying it. That afternoon, they took Juanita to the bridge over the Yuba River. She climbed up on her own, adjusted the noose around her neck, and said she would do it all again. She was the only woman lynched during the entire California gold rush. Number 8. Eliza Farnham. She recruited 200 women for California, and only 3 got on the ship. In 1849, the gold rush had turned California upside down. Men left farms, stores, and families behind to dig in the rivers of the Sierra Nevada. San Francisco grew from 1,000 residents to 25,000 in just over a year. Ships rotted in the bay because entire crews ran off to the gold fields, and there were almost no women. In some camps, there was one for every 100 men. Eliza Farnham thought she could fix that. A widow and the former head of the women's ward at Sing Sing prison, she printed a circular asking for 200 single women of good character who were willing to sail around Cape Horn. She required a letter signed by a minister. Hundreds wrote back. On the day the ship Angelique was set to leave, Farnham counted the female passengers, 3. She made the trip anyway and became a farmer in Santa Cruz. The plan to civilize California came down to 3 tickets. Number 9. Sarah Royce. She crossed the Nevada desert carrying her daughter in her arms. In 1849, more than 30,000 people crossed the continent in search of California gold. Almost all of them were men. Sarah Royce went with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter. In Nevada's 40-mile desert, they took the wrong route. There was no water, no grass, and the oxen were collapsing from exhaustion. Sarah left half their belongings in the sand and kept going on foot, carrying little Mary in her arms. They reached the mountains just as winter was setting in. A few more weeks, and the snow would have closed everything off. A government rescue party showed up just in time. Now comes the part almost no one knows. Her son, Josiah Royce, was born in a mining camp and became a professor at Harvard, one of the greatest philosophers this country ever produced. He said the central idea behind his work, loyalty to the community, came directly from what his mother lived through on that trail. At his request, she wrote everything down in a notebook. The book was not published until 1932, more than 40 years after her death. Number 10. Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, the land already had owners. Her family had controlled thousands of acres since the days of Mexican rule. Then the miners arrived, 300,000 of them within a few years. They drove stakes into the ground, put up fences, and said the land belonged to them, and the American courts sided with them. One by one, the original landowners were driven into bankruptcy just to pay lawyers and prove that the land was already theirs. Maria saw all of this up close. She married an army officer, lived in Washington, and learned how the system worked from the inside. And in 1885, she did something no one expected. She wrote a novel. The Squatter and the Dawn told in English how those families were robbed on paper with stamps and signatures. She had already published another novel in 1872, the first Hispanic-American woman to write novels in English, and it remained forgotten on a shelf for more than 100 years until the 1990s. Number 11. Lee Whipple Haslam. She was not even 10 years old when she crossed the plains in a covered wagon and arrived in the California gold fields, and no child should have seen what she saw. Tuolumne, early 1850s. There was no sheriff, no judge, no jail. Anyone accused of stealing gold was tried under a tree, and the sentence was handed down on the spot. Lee stood there watching men being hanged just a few yards from her front door. She grew up there, surrounded by gunfights, fever, and people who disappeared without explanation. And she kept it all in her memory. 70 years later, as an old woman, she sat down and wrote. No embellishment, no softening. She wrote about the lynchings, about how Mexicans and Chinese people were treated in the camps, and about what the men did when the gold ran out. That slim book became one of the few first-hand accounts of the gold rush written by a woman who was actually there. And almost no one read it. Number 12. Eleanor Dumont, Madame Moustache. By 1854, the gold rush had already turned California upside down. More than 300,000 men had arrived looking for gold, and there were hardly any women in the camps. Nevada City was one of those places, mud, gold dust in people's pockets, and no one to keep order. That was when a French woman in her 20s stepped off the stagecoach with $1,000 in her pocket. Eleanor Dumont opened the 21, a gambling house with mirrors, carpeting, and one rule: no swearing, no dirty hats, and no fighting. Anyone who did not follow the rules was thrown out. She dealt the cards herself, and won. Miners traveled for days just to try to beat the woman who owned the place. Years later, a husband took her money and her cattle ranch. She spent decades traveling across the West, moving from camp to camp and gambling for spare change. That was when she got her nickname, Madame Moustache. In 1879, she was found dead on a road near Bodie. She never rebuilt what she had created. Number 13. Doña Luisa Vallejo, the woman who watched California change hands. Before the gold rush, the Vallejo family controlled almost everything in the area. Her father, General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, owned around 175,000 acres in Northern California. He sided with the Americans in 1846, and they still arrested him during the Bear Flag Revolt. Then came 1848. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and 300,000 people poured onto those lands. In 1 year, San Francisco went from a village to a city. The miners did not ask permission. They put up fences, dug, and stayed. The final blow did not come from a gun. It came from paperwork. The Land Act of 1851 forced every Californio family to prove in court that the land belonged to them. Years of lawyers, translations, and travel followed. In the end, only a few hundred acres remained. Louisa grew up watching it happen, and it was the stories told by the women in her family that preserved what the official records left out: how an entire world can be lost without a single shot being fired. Number 14, the Chilean and Hispanic washerwomen of the Gold Rush. In 1849, California gold attracted more than 300,000 men. Almost none of them brought their wives, and almost none of them knew how to wash a shirt. That was when these women saw an opportunity. In the camps, they charged $8 per dozen pieces of clothing. In New York, a washerwoman earned $1 for the same work. Clean water was scarce, soap was expensive, and dirty clothes could mean disease. Anyone who complained about the price could wash their own clothes in the freezing river. These women dominated the market. While the average miner broke his back in the river and ended the day with nothing, they earned more per hour than he did. With that money, they paid for entire families to travel back to Chile and Mexico. And here is the troubling part: none of them have names. In the censuses from that time, they appear only as washerwomen. No last name, no age, no story. They won the gold rush and disappeared from the record. Number 15, Mary Seacole. In 1851, the fastest route to California gold was not through the desert. It was across Panama by mule and boat. Thousands of men passed through there, and almost all of them arrived sick. That was where Mary Seacole, the daughter of a Jamaican mother and a Scottish father, opened a lodging house in the village of Cruces. When cholera arrived, she treated miners no one else wanted to touch, and learned the hard way what trained doctors did not know. 2 years later, the Crimean War broke out. Mary went to London and offered to work as a nurse. She knocked on 4 doors and was turned down by all of them. The reason was the color of her skin. So she did what she had done since Panama. She paid out of her own pocket, bought a ticket, and went alone. Near the front lines, she built the British Hotel and cared for wounded soldiers on both sides. The soldiers called her Mother Seacole. Florence Nightingale spoke badly about her in private letters. Mary died in 1881, forgotten, and it was not until the 1990s that the world remembered who she had been. Number 16, Charlotte Lottie. Dino, the gambler who always came back. Wherever there was gold, there was a poker table. The metal came out of the ground and went straight into the pockets of anyone who knew how to count cards. Charlotte Tompkins, born in Kentucky in 1844, figured that out early and traveled across Texas and the Southwest under a name that became legendary, Lottie Dino. They say the nickname came from a drunk miner staring at her pile of chips. "Miss, with all that money, they ought to call you Lotta Dinero." She calculated the odds in her head and never moved a muscle in her face. She lost fortunes more than once. She won every one of them back. In Fort Griffin, Texas, she shared a gambling hall with Doc Holliday and Big Nose Kate. Armed men sat down at her table and walked away with nothing. She later married Frank Thurmond, a gambler like her, gave up cards, and moved to Deming, New Mexico, near the silver mines. She opened an honest business and became a respected lady in town. She died in 1934 at the age of 89. Years later, people said she inspired Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke. Number 17, Jenny Lind, the name that made money in California without her ever setting foot there. By 1850, gold in California had already attracted more than 100,000 men. The city grew from 1,000 residents to more than 20,000 in 2 years. On the other side of the country, P.T. Barnum brought Swedish singer Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, to America and turned her tour into a publicity circus. It worked so well that her name became currency. In San Francisco, people who had never heard her sing named a theater, a hotel, a mine, and even a town after Jenny Lind. Investors back east bought shares in mines just because her name was on the sign. The Jenny Lind Theater burned down twice and was eventually sold to become City Hall. And in April 1853, the steamboat Jenny Lind suffered a boiler explosion in San Francisco Bay, killing around 30 passengers. She never went to California. She never received a single cent from any of it. It was the first recorded case of a famous name being used to sell risk to people too far away to check for themselves. Number 18. Nancy Gooch, the woman who bought the land where it all began. She arrived in California in 1849, but she did not come looking for gold. She came as an enslaved woman, brought from Missouri to Coloma, the same place where James Marshall found the first gold nugget a year earlier. In 1850, California entered the Union as a free state. Overnight, Nancy was a free woman in a camp full of armed and desperate men. And here is the part almost no one tells. She stayed. She washed clothes, cooked, and saved money 1 coin at a time. While the miners broke their backs and went home with nothing, Nancy kept saving. It took years, but she bought the freedom of her own son, Andrew, back in Missouri for $700. After that, the family kept buying land in Coloma, piece by piece, until they owned the property where the gold rush had begun. The records are in the El Dorado County archives. Her name appears in almost no books about the gold rush. Number 19. Jessie Benton Fremont. In 1849, when news of the California gold rush spread across the country, John C. Fremont already owned a stretch of land covering nearly 18,000 hectares near Yosemite called Las Mariposas. He had bought it almost by accident. There was gold underneath it, and the person who went there to defend it was not him. Jessie crossed Panama by mule and boat with a young daughter and settled into a wooden house in San Francisco while lawyers, miners, and squatters fought over every foot of the mine. The daughter of a senator, she understood how Washington worked better than her husband did. The reports from his expeditions, the ones that pushed thousands of families west, were written by her. She ran his 1856 presidential campaign. When the gold money disappeared, her articles and books paid the bills. History remembered his nickname, the Pathfinder. Her name was left in the footnotes. Number 20. The Healers of Placer County. In 1850, California had about 50 doctors for every 100,000 people, spread across hundreds of miles of mountains. Anyone who arrived sick at a mining camp did not find a hospital. They found a woman. They were midwives and healers, Mexican, indigenous, and black women, who carried knowledge of herbs passed down from generation to generation. They treated cholera, removed bullets from legs, cared for burns, and delivered babies without any of the equipment a trained doctor would have had. In many camps, they were the only chance a man had of seeing the sun rise the next morning. Then came the turning point. In the 1860s, California created a medical licensing system. Overnight, what these women did became a crime. They were prosecuted, fined, and pushed out of the profession they had practically created in the West. And the most striking part, not one of them has a name in the official record.